So typically when we're talking about squatting, people tend to use language around hamstrings or posterior chain or quad dominant. Well, it's a more useful idea is thinking about what is the body doing with the choices of where I'm putting the load. So the difference, for example, between a low bar back squat and a deadlift really ends up being where the load is hanging, right? So maybe I'm hanging the load here and I have a narrower stance, but a low bar back squat, suddenly I'm a little bit wider and I'm holding the bar much lower on my body. So ultimately what you can start to think about is the more vertical the torso, the more forward knee position you're going to end up with. The more vertical you keep the shin, the more you're going to tip the torso forward or have to tip the torso forward. And that's why we put hinge, squat, hinge together in our archetypes. The difference you could say maybe is the degree of how much upright torso you have and what's going on with the leg. So ultimately, you know, if I'm hinging, I don't have a very large knee flexion demand, right? But if I'm squatting, there's a little bit more knee deflection demand, but the position can remain very similar. The difference, of course, again, is if I'm holding a goblet, you can imagine this, of course, I've got a counterbalance, et cetera, but this asks for a little bit more upright torso. Anything in the front becomes unmanageable and untenable when I start to lean forward. Putting that weight on my back suddenly allows me to handle that load a little bit differently. So a front squat isn't about more quads, but it is about maybe keeping your torso more upright, and that means you're going to have a lot more knee forward position, which would work your quads more. So what's useful about this is you begin to see the connections between the different movements. So foot pressure will remain the same throughout. But where we start to see hiccups sometimes is where athletes are engaged and they're using a squat idea like send your hamstrings back, and that suddenly doesn't work if I'm holding a weight up in the front, doing a front squat, and I send my hamstrings back. That's not a really useful cue. A more useful cue is to let the body do what it needs to do with the weight, with the idea of keep your foot pressure constant between the ball and foot and the heel and your ankle somewhere in the middle of your foot so you're not collapsing side to side. Because what will end up happening then is that in order for me to do that, I'm either going to create a whole bunch of extra spines for myself and have a ton of spine motion I have to account for, or I'll just end up lowering myself down, keeping my pressure even in the feet and let the torso go where it goes. And what's useful about that is that that gets away then from having to coach a certain specific shape for my athletes. Like, I think your shin should be here. Look, there's enough anthropometry differences between the length of my torso and length of Eric's torso and the length of his femur and my femur that ultimately looking at what's the goal? More upright torso squat? Maybe that ends up being a front squat or even an overhead squat. If I have a person who has really, really long femurs and isn't going to like front squatting very much, maybe that's a reason to safety bar squat them or high bar back squat them, right? It allows us to have a little bit more flexibility with their anthropometry. So in short, instead of kind of going down this rabbit hole, let's look at squatting as the same. The difference are what's going on with the shoulder to stabilize the bar, where is the load, and ultimately the torso is either going to be upright with the knees forward or the shin's going to be vertical and the torso is going to be forward, like a kettlebell swing. So the choice is yours, and then you can start to decide what you want to bias towards. And it turns out, of course, this is why coaches say things like Olympic lifting really transfers to sports well, where you have to keep your torso upright, be able to jump and land, and keep your center of mass kind of vertical in those positions, right? Back squat allows you to handle the largest loads on the planet. Why? Well, you suddenly understand that we don't have to account for that forward knee. So when you're thinking about selection, think about where the load is and what the goal is, because that has interesting implications on rehab for knees and squatting and rehab for backs and squatting. Stay tuned for parts 2 and 3.